Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Frames of Space. One topic that I've gotten really interested in exploring and trying to understand a little bit of the nuances of is gender inequality. This episode is an exploration of one specific facet of it, which is gender differences between boys and girls, gender differences between men and women as they pertain to society. Because I think it's really interesting to understand the debate about gender differences and how much of the differences between boys and girls are socialized and how much of it is just down to biological differences. And I think that when it comes to the way that boys and girls are treated in society, this is one area where none of us have all of the answers. So we should strive to be as open-minded as possible and even more willing to entertain ideas that we previously considered to be wrong-headed or even reactionary. So I think that today's guest does a pretty good job inhabiting one angle of this debate. Today's guest is Ruth Whippman. Ruth Whippman is an author and journalist who writes a lot about present-day cultural issues. She is also the author of the new book titled BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. She approaches this specific topic of gender from a different and more cultural angle than the way that it's traditionally been explored. But it is an angle that is incredibly important because of the ways that culture affects us all. What is the culture surrounding the ways that boys are treated from a very young age? And what type of messaging does that tell them about who they can be and who they can't be? She's spent so much time trying to sort out a lot of the different contradictions and cognitive dissonance that she's had as a progressive feminist, but also as a mother of boys at the same time. And the ways that the Me Too era has fundamentally shaped her own views about this subject in a lot of different directions, both during her time raising her boys from when they were very young, in addition to her time seeing a lot of bad behavior about men in the news during the Me Too era. So I guess as someone who, me personally, I like to see this issue from a subtly different point of view, but it was very interesting and very fascinating to talk to her about a lot of her point of view on this subject. And I really hope that you enjoy this conversation. Ruth Whippman, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
It's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I guess one of the most helpful frameworks that I think we could use in order to get a better understanding on your views of this issue is to sort of talk us through the way that your views have changed. So let's pretend that this is like 15 years ago. What were your views back then on things like feminism or toxic masculinity or like gender essentialism and such?
So 15 years ago, I mean, that's going back quite a long way because I didn't have children at that point. So I think my views on all of it were different. I think in terms of feminism, the cultural conversation was really different at that point. And I think even when I had my first son nearly 14 years ago, it was almost like if you had a boy, you didn't really need to worry about gender, or kind of the pressures of like gendered socialization. It was just like boys were just the default. Men were just default humans. And if you had a girl, then you had to worry about gender. You had to worry about feminist issues, about, body image and oppression and the changing roles. But for boys, it was just something that was very unexamined. And so I think at that point, I just really hadn't thought about masculinity and what it meant for boys, what it meant for men, what it meant for the world in general. It was a very, very unexamined thing for me. And I think beyond that, I guess I felt that gender was something that was socialized, that, that I could just kind of, if I had, that boys and girls only really behaved differently because we treated them differently. And I think there is now, I think there is a big element of socialization, but I think there also is a big element of biology in there as well. And so I think, my views have really evolved, both from having children, from the wider cultural conversation, and from doing the research for this book.
Yeah, and I think one of the most interesting like facets of that would be the way that both like Me Too and like sort of raising boys at the exact same time has sort of
Yeah,
like affected your views in like both in two different ways. So I'm going to quote your book right now. Quote,
sure.
as a feminist, this moment in history would be one of the most clarifying, exhilarating times of my life. But as a mother of boys, it would twist my stomach into a knot of fear and hypocrisy, a tangle of competing envies and hopes and contradictions that would take a long time to fully unravel. End quote. Yeah, so could you talk a little bit more about some of the cognitive dissonance that you felt from trying to raise boys in the era of Me Too?
Yeah, so the moment that I'm referring to there, it's right at the beginning of the book, and I am in that moment, I'm like nearly 9 months pregnant with a third boy. And the Me Too movement just explodes online. So Weinstein's exposed in October. And then, like, one by one by one, it just feels like we're at a point where pretty much every man in America is exposed as a sex offender. I mean, that's obviously an exaggeration, but it felt like, oh my gosh, there's this real systemic problem. And women are talking about it in this whole new way. Suddenly, like women had this voice and people were listening. So I feel like pretty much every woman has had experiences of sexual violence, sexual harassment, and nobody ever really listened. We'd be like, oh, this happened. And everyone would be like, well, be quiet, time, just be a good sport about it and don't worry. And it's not really a problem. And he's just a bad apple. And suddenly the conversation had turned on its head and people were listening to women. And as a feminist, it felt really exhilarating. It was like, yes, we're naming the problem. It's a systemic problem. It's not just a few bad guys. It's like something much deeper. We're talking about it. Women had like control of the
Like
conversation for the
the
first time.
Overton window had shifted significantly, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. As I wrote in the book, like the overted window, we'd crowbarred it out of the men's locker room and we'd reinstalled it in the gender studies department. So it's like, yes, we were allowed to have these conversations and it was very different. But as a mother of boys, it was really challenging because it was scary. I think on one level, I was scared. I was like, is it just this inevitability that men are terrible and that, my children are going to end up being sexual predators or school shooters or incels? I didn't really feel that, but I was like, God, is there something inevitable in this? And then obviously we were like going wrong on a very systemic level in how we were raising boys. I'm just starting to realize that the fact that this was so normalized in our culture. So I really was like, oh God, this task ahead of me is so scary and so big and so much pressure to like push against all these cultural norms that are pushing boys in this direction. And so it felt like a lot of pressure. And also, it just felt kind of defensive, on this very basic maternal level. It's like people are saying bad things about my kids and I don't want them to, because every time anyone said men and boys are terrible, I'm like, no, they're not. Look how sweet my baby is, And so I think it was a real tangle of complicated feelings. And the book is a process of unpacking all that and trying to figure out what's reasonable, what's unreasonable, what we can do as individuals, what we can't do, how we change that cultural conversation, and start to have it in a way that's productive rather than destructive.
Yeah. But one thing that you mentioned that think I should pick up on maybe in the future is like trying to unpack what's reasonable and what's unreasonable. I think that when it comes to gender equality, especially, this is a topic where the Overton window has shifted so rapidly in so many different directions over the past 15 years that who knows, maybe some of the stuff that we think is unreasonable is going to turn out to be reasonable in a few years or vice versa.
Absolutely. And that has happened within my lifetime. I mean, I've seen that happen over and over again. So I remember being a
Like
kid and
for both genders, yeah.
for everybody, yeah, and all kind, not just about gender, about all kinds of topics where it used to be so routine to just say these really sexist things. Like teachers would just say these incredibly sexist things to us when we were kids, and it was just normal. And if you complained, then you were a bad sport. You had no sense of humor. All these kinds of things. Homophobia. I mean, that's another thing. It was just so ingrained. authority figures would say homophobic things regularly when I was a kid. And now that's no longer acceptable. And, it's just we have shifted in what we can stomach, we've shifted in what we can take on. And it's changing all the time. And it's changing faster than we can really keep up with, I think. So it's hard you're right, it's very hard to sift through what, in real time, what this stuff actually means.
Yeah, like for all we know, maybe some of the cultural stuff in your book is just going to be outdated in like 3 or 4 years.
Right, exactly. And maybe we'll go more in the direction of like gender doesn't exist at all, or maybe we'll go more in the direction of everybody identifies as a sort of mix of different things, or we'll double down on the rigidity of like masculine, feminine, and all these things are happening simultaneously as well.
Yeah.
We're getting more free and there's a backlash, and all of these many contradictory things are true all at the same time.
Yeah, like for all we know, maybe there are some views that we currently think are misogynistic that are just going to be accepted by mainstream society in 5 years.
I'm sure, because misogyny is it feels like misogyny is always as kind of a staple of our world. So we're always finding new ways to reinvent it.
Yeah. But yeah, just to narrow it, at least for now. So like
Yeah.
one of the things I found really interesting is how like traditionally as a feminist, and this might be partly because of your upbringing, is that like you used to think that like gender didn't matter and like differences between boys and girls were just like a product of socialization, a product of like different parenting styles, different teaching styles. They cause them to act differently, and it's not a product of biology. But one of the things I found interesting is that like when you actually started having sons, you sort of really like started to change your tune about that because you originally wanted to like socialize them to act differently than like boys normally would. And then you would realize that like certain aspects of their character, whether it be like increased aggression or like their tendency to hit each other with Lego bricks, like maybe some of that is biological. Like could you explain some of that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a really complicated thing. And again, there's we're talking when we talk about the differences between boys and girls, we're really talking at a group level. It may not apply to any individual. So everyone's got stories of the wild rambunctious girl and the compliant docile boy, and
it's like a statistical distribution and not like a hard and fast rule.
Exactly. And so we have to bear that in mind however we're talking about it. But yes, I was absolutely blindsided by how wild and physical my boys were, and at a level that was just nothing that I recognized from my own childhood, from being a kid myself, from my friends. It was just a whole different level. And maybe they're at the sort of upper end of that distribution, but also, a lot of mothers of boys were saying, or parents of boys were saying a similar thing, which is just like, whoa, this is something else that I hadn't realized. And I think so I started digging into the sort of science of gender, and I think there are elements of this which are rooted in biology. And there's pretty clear evidence that boys do have a higher physical level of activity. There is more of this kind of rough and tumble play. It's connected with fetal testosterone, and they've sort of done pretty careful studies where they manipulate that process in other mammals, and you can see that it has a direct effect. And male brains mature more slowly. They catch up in the end, but it takes them longer. And so especially things like impulse control, emotional self-regulation take longer for boys to get to on average. And so I think that there are differences rooted in biology. And I think that, not acknowledge that is not very helpful for anybody. I think it sort of acknowledging it means that we can help both parents and kids to sort of understand themselves. And I think that's always important.
Do you remember that time on Twitter when like you were sort of like getting into this like half non-argument with Richard Reeves, where like he pointed out that one he thought that you were mischaracterizing what you were saying,
Yeah.
and then like you mentioned that like you were only talking about like one small part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so Richard Reeves, I don't know, presumably your listeners know who Richard Reeves is.
If you want, you can spend like two
Yeah.
two seconds talking,
Okay,
like
so
giving
Richard
like a
Reeves is
credential check.
the
Yeah.
author. He runs the American Institute for Boys and Men, and he's the author of a book called Of Boys and Men, which talks about many of the same themes that I talk about in BoyMom. But he's more of a kind of policy person. He works for the Brookings Institute. He is really talking at a kind of social policy level for how we help boys and men. But we're also recognizing many of similar trends that boys are struggling in our society. And I'm sort of focusing more on the culture, socialization, the home, and he's focusing more on sort of social policy. But anyway, so Richard Reeves has a lot to say about education, and one of his big ideas is that boys should all be redshirted. That boys should be held back because male brains develop more slowly. That actually we should start boys in kindergarten a year later than we start girls, and that's a policy proposal, which I don't personally agree with for various reasons. But I think Richard Reeves is great. I think he's done amazing work in this field. I think that he has been really, I think been able to have a really respectful conversation about broadly, we agree on most things. There are some differences of opinion. And I think we've been able to discuss those respectfully in a way that I think is really important. I think talking about these issues is critical. Examining our own views and discussion, I think, is really critical. I think Richard believed that I had said that he was focusing too much on biology. And I think that was probably a fair criticism, but also I was sort of really trying to characterize it very much in terms of his views on education policy.
Yeah. Or maybe it's just like sometimes I get the impression that like when people are writing something, they have to deliver like their arguments with a greater degree of like moral fervor than if you were to just like talk with someone. Because
Yeah.
I almost felt like there was like a tension here with your book where like you had to like you have to draw the line and come up with like very strong arguments about like whether or not something counts as sexism, but it almost felt like you are trying to do that while also qualifying your point at the same time. But like if you said
Yeah.
it in like a wishy-washy way, it would have felt kind of boring. So what you did is like you argued for it forcefully and then like maybe like gave an anecdote that suggested that like there was still a little bit of doubt.
Possibly. Yeah. I mean, I think I think this is a really sort of hard thing to get into in this context because we're talking about a very specific policy point in a very specific discussion on a very specific issue that what I was trying not to do was to characterize Richard Reeves's whole position on gender and socialization on nature versus nurture. But I think it was very much in the context of this one conversation about education and redshirting. But I think, yes, you can pull out one line and say, I believe that Richard Reeves believes this. And yes, it can be an overstatement of that problem. But, if anyone's interested, go read my chapter on education, go read Richard Reeves's wonderful writings on this topic. I think that we're actually really not very far apart at all. And we both agree that that boys and men are struggling in many ways and that they need help. And we both believe, I think Richard Reeves and I both believe that it's a combination of nature and nurture. It's just slight differences of emphasis and slight differences in where we then go with that.
Yeah, so like maybe you think that like the biological differences are like 30% true and he thinks that they're like 50% true, something like that.
Possibly, or it's just more like, what do we do with this information? No one will know. No one can know, put a percentage on it and say it's 30% or it's whatever. We know that it's a combination of both, but it's just more about what we do with that information and how we proceed. And I think the red shirting thing, I believe that the evidence doesn't support it. Richard Reeves believes that it does. Anyone who's interested in this topic, and it's quite nerdy, we're in some deep nerd education policy stuff here. Anyone is free to go and look up those studies and see what they think.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of the ways that like having kids has affected your views on this, because I still find it endlessly fascinating. Because like when you were talking, I guess there's one quote from the book that like really stood out to me, where you said, quote, during this time, my boys do sometimes seem more animal than human, but they aren't like dogs. Dogs can be trained to follow commands, walk to heel, rescue children from wells, and perch coquettishly in fancy purses. At times, my boys seem more like rabid wolves, and ever present in the back of my mind is the cold dread that it will be a straight line from this grade school house of horrors to pussy grabbing and school shooting. Wow,
Yeah.
that hit hard. Like, did you ever think that like maybe there were some parts of like boys and men where it's like just their like inherent nature, where like you could see a causal line between that and like some of the more like horrific like instances of Me Too?
Well, so here's the thing. So I do want to say that this is like again from a very specific time in our life when things were going completely crazy. So we just had a third baby. Our older two kids went completely wild. They were very jealous. It was we'd thrown our whole sort of family system off its axis and everyone was kind of going wild. So lots of things were happening. And our kids are not like that now, actually. They're very thoughtful and gentle and they've calmed down a lot. I would not describe them as rabid wolves at all. They're like delightful humans. Um, I think a lot of things were going on there. So I think there is an element of biology. There was an element of just like they'd had a complicated event happen in their life. I think it is gendered in the sense that probably on average, if you'd had three girls in that situation, it might have looked different on average, not always. Um, and I think for me, it was just like it was so freighted with this cultural baggage. So we're talking about Me Too. I'm looking in the news every day. There's a news story of, male violence, male harm, school shootings, incels. And this is going on for me at home. And so it's really hard to unpack what is gender? What is having a new baby brother? What is just normal boyhood? What is just normal childhood? What is toxic masculinity? I definitely do not believe that it's inevitable that boys will behave, that boys will grow up to be aggressive, violent men. There is so much that we can do. I think it is a little harder to get there in many ways. I think that you're fighting that a little more for all kinds of reasons, but I definitely don't think it's inevitable. I think that was what I was writing at this very, very fraught point in my life. And I was trying to be very honest about my fears and feelings.
Yeah, so I guess here's a point that I would make where I'm not even sure if I disagree with you or if it's like a difference in emphasis or something
Mhm.
else. But like your whole point about how like it's not inevitable for like boys to grow up and be like these like really
Mhm.
aggressive people. I guess maybe we would approach this differently because maybe you would say that we could like socialize them to be a little bit more docile, whereas maybe I would say that like maybe certain aspects of increased aggression which like biologically like boys tend to exhibit to a greater degree than girls. Maybe the solution is not to try to get rid of it, but instead to acknowledge it and find a way to like channel that aggression to more positive ends. Like, would you consider that to be a disagreement or like a difference in emphasis or something else?
Hmm. I think it's interesting. It's probably like a more sort of I don't think there's an either or actually. I think that all humans have aggression in them. All humans have pro-social impulses as well. And I think with everybody that we're trying to, I think suppressing innate aggression and not allowing any outlet for it is not helpful for any human being. But yes, we need to channel it and focus it and, find ways to regulate it. And so that's true for boys and for girls. And, aggression comes out in many different ways, like verbally, physically, all the rest of it. Um, I think with boys, there's often this sort of drive. People, when they talk about parenting boys, they're like, what they need is more, there's sort of this story, which is just like, boys are naturally physically active and aggressive. So what they need is more of that. So it's like double down, So it's like they love wrestling. So what they need is more wrestling. And they love physical activity. So what they need is more sports. And like, great as far as it goes. But I feel like that's quite a limiting construct. Yes, absolutely. Sports, wrestling, all of those things are great. But boys get a lot of that stuff very naturally through life. There's all this research that shows that the way that parents, the way that teachers, and the way that the world interacts with boys is in these very physical ways. So parents roughhouse with their boys all the time, but they don't spend a lot of time talking with them about their feelings, for
Maybe
example.
we should do both. Maybe we should roughhouse with
We
them
should do
and
both
talk about their
and
feelings.
talk about their feelings,
Yeah.
right? And I feel like both kids of both genders or all genders need those things, all of those things. And I think what happens is that we use the nature aspect to kind of ignore the nurture aspect. We're like, oh, this is what they're naturally like, so let's just keep giving them more of that. And I think we do better to look at what's missing and what's absent and what they don't get and what boys are sort of deprived of in our culture and try to correct for that rather than just giving them more of this like wrestling and roughhousing. Not to say that there's anything wrong with any of those things, but it's just like they get it. They get that all the time.
Yeah. Well, so I definitely agree we should do more of both. So I guess let's switch a little bit and talk about what you think they need to do like more of. So could you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about how in the present day maybe society sort of like stigmatizes men who want to be a little bit more like emotionally vulnerable? Because I thought that was a
Yeah.
pretty interesting part of your book.
Yeah. So I think that well, look, there is, I think I'm just going to take it back a bit, which is like starting from birth, really, people respond to baby boys and baby girls in different ways. So there's all this research that shows that people believe baby boys are like tougher and angrier and more robust, and they roughhouse with them more. Even like right from birth, they sort of jiggle them, they handle them in different ways. They talk to girls more, they're way more verbal with girls, like right from the beginning. And this is before the babies themselves are showing any gendered differences. And they give boys less of that kind of caretaking, nurturing touch and more of that like roughhousing touch. And then all the way through childhood,
Yeah.
parents, sorry,
Do
go
you
ahead.
think it's possible to like do like roughhouse in a way that is like emotionally nurturing? Do you think that's possible?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think that, it is, yes, these things are not mutually exclusive, in the sense of like, there's something very loving about the way that a father might roughhouse with his son. It's not like a bad thing. It's like a lovely thing often. But it's just that what we don't do with boys is we don't sort of talk to them about their feelings. We spend, there's all this sort of data that shows that the parents spend a lot more time with girls talking about emotions, listening to their emotions. They use different vocabularies. And then, like in the culture, there's far less sort of stories and books and movies and all the rest of it, which are show boy characters being emotional, having like emotional connections with other humans, like very deep relationships. And then we have all these messages on top about masculinity and be tough and be strong and suppress your emotions, man up, all the rest of it. And they're quite subtle, but they're very consistent through the culture. So I think boys get to the point where they feel like they can't even identify their own emotions to a certain extent, let alone express them to other people and especially to other men, to other male peers. And I think across the board, I interviewed many boys of different types. And this was something they said very consistently. Like they just felt like they couldn't talk about their emotions to other male peers. And a lot of them wanted to, but they just felt like there was this prohibition, social prohibition. And I believe that is really damaging. I think we need to model to boys how to do that and that is important.
Yeah. So I guess this is one part of your book where you were talking to like Cade Janes, who was trying to sort of deal with a community and try to like what he
Yeah.
would consider that to be like trying to deal with healthy masculinity.
Mhm.
But I guess like one of the points that I would like for you to explain is could you talk about some of like the benefits that can accrue from having boys and men be more emotionally vulnerable to each other?
Yeah. Well, I think, for every human, like being able to be a fully emotional being is really at the heart of being a person, to be able to identify your own emotions, to express them, to ask for help if you're in pain, and I think you see this in the mental health data, there's this sort of weird phenomenon whereby boys, when you do statistics, girls will report as being more depressed than boys. They will report depression in far greater numbers, but boys die by suicide nearly 4 times as often as girls. So there's this way in which they're not telling anybody that they're depressed, that they're not reporting that they're depressed until it's so far along that they can't be helped and this tragedy happens. And this is a very male pattern that they'll just keep it inside, they'll suppress it. And so, there's that side of it, which is avoiding tragedy. But just even on a, even if we're talking about it at a less tragic, less horrifying level, it's just about living a full emotional life and being able to connect deeply with other people. And also, it's not just about being able to express your own emotions, it's about being able to be present for other people's emotions, to notice them, to help track them, to help to see yourself as emotionally responsible for another person. That is absolutely at the heart of human connection. And I think we have an epidemic of loneliness among adult men and among adolescent boys. And the inability to be emotional with friends is really at the heart of it, I think.
Yeah, so I think that's a good rundown of why it's so good for men to be emotionally vulnerable to each other, and why, to a large extent, a lot of men aren't emotionally vulnerable to each other.
Mhm.
So I guess the next question I have is, could you talk about some of the research you found that suggests that incels, of all people, often display greater levels of emotional vulnerability than other men do?
Oh, yeah, that was such a surprising thing to me. And this isn't really research. It's like well, when I say research, it's not like studies show that incels are more vulnerable. This is just something that I discovered because I spent some time in incel spaces in the manosphere. So I went on incel message boards and I did some pretty deep interviews with a couple of incels in particular, and a few more that aren't really in the book, but where I talked to them very deeply. And I think there's a lot of things going on with the incels, which is really interesting. So these guys, so incel stands for involuntary celibate. They're guys who don't have sex, they don't have partners, they're very lonely, they're usually extremely depressed, and they sort of have all these very sort of strong beliefs about masculinity. They believe that, there's these like alpha males called Chads who are genetically successful and masculine, and they can never be like that. And the incels are just kind of genetically doomed to this hopeless life of loneliness and whatever. And they also have some really horrific beliefs about women. They're often extremely misogynistic, extremely racist, every type of like horrible, you know,
Yeah.
view that a person can hold is there in that community. But what was really interesting was there was something about these boys and men that they were in these online spaces and they felt liberated from all of those like traditional masculine norms that are saying, be tough, be strong, don't express your emotions and all the rest of it. It's almost like because they felt like they could never succeed in systems of traditional masculinity, they were so hopeless. It was just like they'd given up. And that was almost kind of freeing for them, that they felt like, oh, well, I've got nothing to lose. I might as well be emotionally vulnerable with my friends. And they were so vulnerable with each other. And so that in these spaces, as well as this like toxic stuff, there was this deep sense of belonging and brotherhood and connection. And they were talking about their feelings. They were talking about how they felt in ways that men really don't very often in real life spaces. And a couple of those guys, really talked to me about that. They said, this is very liberating, and it's something that I haven't found anywhere else as a man.
Yeah, there was one quote in your book that I thought, like, it made an impression on me, so I'm going to quote it right now. I had spent all this time searching for a space in which boys and young men felt they could disregard masculine norms, take off the mask, and be vulnerable with each other. I thought I might find it in some kind of feminist affinity circle or a therapy group run by a soft-spoken vegan. But instead, I had found it right here at the heart of the manosphere, in toxic masculinity central. So
Yeah.
yeah, like in terms of like men being able to disregard masculine norms and be vulnerable with each other, why do you think you are a lot more likely to find it with the incel community than with like feminist circles?
So I don't necessarily think that I think so. Look, it's not that I think it's impossible to find this in feminist circles. And I think that feminism has a huge amount to contribute to boys and men being able to be more emotionally vulnerable. I think what had happened in this particular situation was just partly that these guys were anonymous online, but partly because they had just given up on on achieving the kind of masculine status that I think all boys and men are in some kind of lifelong conversation with this like expectation of masculinity, whether they reject it altogether or whether they feel that they have to live up to it or that they can't reject it or whatever. Boys and men are always in conversation with this ideal one way or another. And I think the thing about the incels is that they just had got to the point where they're like, I will never achieve that. This will never be me. I will never be successful in this system. So screw it. I am just going to, show up however I show up. And there was this sort of reckless freedom in that for them that was really, in some ways incredibly toxic and unhealthy. And in some ways, like tapping into something that was like this deep human need that they were getting something from it. And so this is why I say my answer to that is not like, great, send your son off to the incels. That's where he's going to be emotionally vulnerable and healthy. It's more like, can we, that if you're, as a boy or man, you're not getting that sense of belonging and connection elsewhere, you will probably, the risk is that you will go and look for it in those kinds of spaces.
So maybe the solution is to continue to condemn the misogynistic elements of the incel community while also like learning from incels in terms of like how to be emotionally vulnerable. Is that what you're saying?
I think I think that's probably further than I want to go with that. I don't think that we should be learning from incels about how to be emotionally vulnerable. I think we should be learning from the lessons of what has happened and the tragedy of that community in our wider cultural conversation to apply. I think it's more like a lesson to us on how we need to meet boys and men's needs for emotion and connection elsewhere if we don't want them to go looking for it in those toxic spaces.
Yeah. But I guess, yeah, one thing that I found interesting about your book is that like there were some parts where you gestured to it. I think I might go a little bit farther than you. But I do want to hear your opinion on this, partly to explain to the audience and partly to like unpack it a little bit more. So like later on in the book, you said something that I found kind of interesting, which was like, quote, paradoxically, the same people who urge men to be more emotionally expressive are also the ones who take a principled stand against hearing how men actually feel, end quote. So are you referring to like progressive feminists with that quote?
I think so. I think that there is this like very strong tradition within feminism of acknowledging that patriarchy harms men, that these patterns are harmful, and that patriarchy, is not all roses for men either. So that is part of feminist thinking. But I think in the post-Me Too era, the tone has become very much like we've kind of forgotten about that. It's like everyone learned it in their gender studies class in college and then promptly forgot about it. And now we've focused.
Yeah, like how like there was a period of time in the aftermath of Me Too where like kill all men was like a trend.
Kill all men. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that kind of very misandrist rhetoric. And it sort of, I think women and girls were so angry with men, and that anger was very justified. Men had caused real harm. And so I think what we got was this outpouring of just like anger and rage. And, the response was just like, men are terrible. And also that men benefit from patriarchy is like it all works in men's favor. Men have all this privilege, time for men to shut up and everyone else to have a voice. So it's rooted in something that's important. Like it is important for everybody else to have a voice. And in some ways, men have had a voice way more than everybody else. And that's real. And men have had privileges and benefits from patriarchy. But patriarchy is a complicated system that also really harms men. And although they've had a voice in terms of their opinions, like people tend to give male opinions a lot of value and weight, they've spent far less time listening to male feelings. And so boys and men often don't have their feelings heard. They have their opinions heard and not their feelings.
And maybe that applies to both the right and the left for different reasons.
Yes, absolutely. So I think on the right, you have this narrative, which is just like, man up, squash your feelings, be a guy, don't be emotionally vulnerable. And on the left, you have this narrative, which is like, shut up, you're so privileged. If you talk about your feelings or your concerns, it's like taking airtime away from a woman or somebody who's more marginalized. And so I think that what ends up happening is that boys and men feel very shut down from all sides. They feel that they can't speak to their own experience and their own pain. And so, it goes back to this thing that I was saying. Well, okay. So I think what ends up happening as well is that I think that people feel like they can kind of target men and make these misandrous jokes, and they see it as punching up. It's like it doesn't count as bullying because men are privileged. And so it's okay to like punch up with a joke. It's like okay to like mock your boss, but it's not okay to mock your employee, for example. So I think we think we're punching up, but often it doesn't feel that way, especially doesn't feel that way to boys who are young and they're children and they're vulnerable. And also, it doesn't always feel that way to men because in some ways they benefit from this system, but in other ways they really are deprived of some important things in this system as well. So it's a very complex equation.
Yeah. I guess this is another area where, once again, I don't even know if it counts as a disagreement or if it's like a difference. But I guess I want you to reiterate something. So you know how like you talk about how like when it comes to like progressive feminists, like throwing jabs at men, or in some
Mhm.
cases like jokingly talking about killing them. Like normally you would say that this is like a power dynamic of like the
Mhm.
oppressed going against the oppressors. But in this case, like maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah,
So could
I
you
think so.
spend like just a few sentences just recapping that?
Right. So I think so the sort of understanding that or the framework that we're using here, which is like privileged and oppressed, I think that works very well with something like talking about race, for example. But when we're talking about gender, I think it's not always a extreme, or the framework is too oversimplified. I think it's not always very helpful because yes, men do have privilege in many ways. And so, and they do have power. But even within the system, they what they gain in power, they lose in emotionality, in intimacy, in connection, in relationships. So the system benefits them and it harms them. So I think, to just be like, oh, they're fair game for ridicule, they're fair game for mockery, they're fair game for hatred, doesn't acknowledge the fact that they're also harmed in this system. And so if we really, I think, and especially, I feel this especially strongly when we're talking about children. So when we're talking about boys, to just be like, kill all men, I think for a boy growing up to hearing that is really harmful. And I think it's not a helpful way to have these conversations.
Yeah. Okay, I think I mostly do agree with you. I guess the one caveat that I would add is that in general, I think most of the people using these phrases and slogans are more cynical than us and aren't really doing them with like they aren't thinking about gender in this really complex ways that we're thinking about them. I think they're just like saying something to get by in their social circle and aren't
I
really
think that's
thinking.
also true. Yeah, these things take on a momentum and people don't even really think about them. So, like male tears, I don't know if you remember that meme, but it was just like a man would say something and they'd be like, oh, male tears, smallest violin, boo hoo. And it's like, I think people just say it. They don't really often mean terrible harm. But like, if you think about that, you're communicating. This was coming from the left, and we're trying to get men to be more emotionally expressive. But then you're undermining that so clearly by saying, well, okay, you do cry, you do express your pain, and we're just going to shut you down.
Yeah. So maybe in the present day, a lot of progressive feminists basically have like unfair and even slightly contradictory expectations for how they want men to act in present day society.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think, it comes from a good place, and they're coming from a place of wanting equality. They're coming from a place of righting wrongs and all of that. But I think if we are talking about genuinely shifting cultural norms for the next generation, we need to think in more empathetic, more complex ways about all this.
Yeah, like it's not yeah, I guess I would largely agree and maybe we have to like think beyond the sort of like sloganeering phrases that we've traditionally used in the
Yeah,
past.
absolutely.
Yeah, but it does remind me. There's this one quote. Yeah, I'm gonna just keep quoting your book. Yeah. So, quote: "It occurs to me how impossible it must feel for teenage boys who, since
Hmm.
birth, have received generally miserable, inadequate training in the subtleties of human social and emotional dynamics.
Hmm.
They are told, on the one hand, that they need to be masculine and domineering and confident, and on the other, that if they overstep by the tiniest smidge, they will ruin someone's life. Um,
Mhm.
and like that really spoke to me in general. I think that, yeah, what do you, I think that we've talked about this a little bit before, but do you think that in general, maybe a lot of like progressives, when it comes to the way that they expect men to act, maybe they sort of want to have their cake and eat it too, in terms of they want men to take on a lot of the responsibilities they've previously taken on in terms of like being dominant and being confident, while also wanting them to take on a lot more of like present day, more like left wing coded responsibilities as well.
Yeah, I think it can kind of veer into that territory. That quote was actually talking about sex and dating. So it's like, and I think that's probably the area where it shows up the most keenly, because I think that for boys, they're starting to feel like, and we're talking about straight boys in heterosexual relationships, that they're still expected to be masculine and confident and make the first move and come off as like dominant. And it's not just boys that are expecting that of them, girls expect that too. And there's lots of research on that girls hold boys to this like standard of masculinity. They expect that from them. But at the same time, yes, they have to be cautious and sensitive and nuanced and like not overstep. And cancel culture is a very, very real thing. And so yes, in theory, boys should be able to do both. Of course, you should be able to like be confident without overstepping, be interact with gender however you want to, and not be a like sexual predator. But in reality, I think these things are very nuanced, and what might feel to one person as a kind of you know confident and appropriately masculine man might feel to another person like somebody who's aggressive and overstepping. And I think, as you pointed out, that boys have had this like terrible training in all of this. They haven't had a good education in like picking up those social cues,
And
forming
maybe even if
relationships.
even if they did have training, maybe that training would only work for like one specific type of woman, and like
Mhm.
everyone else would have like completely different standards.
Different views. And I think it's just like, and what we've got into is this really like punitive tone when we talk about boys and men. So I think on the left, there's this tendency, and it's not everybody, but there's sort of veering in that direction where it's like boys are the villains and girls are the victims, and I think it feels very unfair to boys and men. They don't see themselves that way. They're often not doing anything villainous. They're just trying to sort of navigate a system and do the best they can. And they don't really know. And of course, there are villains. There are terrible people in this world. And there are boys who are like exploiting girls. And that's very real. But I think that those categories really aren't helpful. I think what we would do better is to just be able to talk openly about these things, share how these things are difficult, have more education, more open conversations, more, just more empathy for everybody else.
Yeah, and more willingness to entertain views that we might have previously considered to be reactionary.
Absolutely. And from the other side too, I think girls are socialized to please. They're socialized to sort of accept things that don't feel good, that there's this phenomenon that Melissa Febos, the writer, writes about called empty consent, which is like that girls will often like consent to something that really doesn't feel good and feels violating because they've been socialized to please men. And so they'll be like, oh, okay, so nobody's like said no, but it feels terrible and it feels violating, and nobody's able to, they're not able to be assertive enough in that situation, and boys are not able to pick up on the social cues that they're like not feeling good about it. And so I think we need to have more nuanced conversations around this for everyone.
Yeah, and like in those cases of empty consent, maybe it's the sort of situation where like it's definitely not ideal, but it's also something where you can't really blame any individual person
Right,
for it.
exactly. It's like feels terrible to everybody, but nobody's assaulted anybody. If somebody gives consent, you can't use the language of assault to talk about that. And I think that's another thing that we quite often use this language of assault and criminal, kind of criminal language to talk about things that are really about complex human dynamics.
Yeah, and I think there was one part of that that I found really interesting when you were talking to people like when it came to that one conference about like false rape
Oh yeah.
allegations. Yeah, one thing that I found really interesting is about how a lot of the time it's hard to find like a hard and fast legal definition of consent.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really interesting because what is consent? Because and in some states in the US and in a lot of college campuses, the definition is like affirmative consent, which is this idea that it's not just like, yes, I agree to this contractual obligation. It's like, I am enthusiastically going into this. But like, how do you measure that? That they have to like say, is there some form of words legally that a person needs to have said in order for sex to be legal? Like, do they need to have said the word, yes, I consent to that? And nobody wants that. Nobody wants some like legally mandated script. And so I think that, most of the time, the vast majority of time, this is fine. And people know when they're consenting and like the vast majority of sex is consensual. But like when there's this gray area, is it like is it the responsibility on one person to read the nonverbal cues of another person? How strong do those nonverbal cues have to be? Do they have to have said something? And then consent has to be ongoing. So it's like they can withdraw consent at any time, but you can withdraw it non-verbally, and I think it's just very hard to navigate. So the professor Aya Gruber, who I interview in the book, she's a law professor and a very interesting scholar and writer. I think she writes about this and she's like, this is extremely difficult territory. And there, on the one hand, there's like these very clear cases of assault. And on the other hand, there's these like absolute gray areas where two people, it's not like someone's lying and someone's telling the truth. It's that two people can have a very different view of the same situation.
And it's possible for both views to be valid.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, as we're moving into this era where we are really understanding consent and coercion in whole new ways, we're understanding that these can be like really subtle social and emotional dynamics between two humans rather than like a literal yes or no. Um, it's bound to be incredibly tricky. And once we start seeing this as this like problem of the criminal justice system and something that needs to be legally, I mean, obviously we need those legal protections, but I think in a lot of these cases involving teenagers, they're just two very inexperienced people trying to make trying to make something work and not really knowing what's happening.
Yeah. So I guess I do find it interesting how like in the midst of all this you do talk about how like girls are socialized to please. Does
Mhm.
that so like your example would be like empty consent where like they might give consent in a
Mhm.
case where they don't really want to, but they're sort of conditioned to do it. Do you think that there are times like where like girls are conditioned to not be that assertive? So maybe even in times where they would want to like give like complete permission to like the other partner, they wouldn't say so explicitly, but would try to like imply it with social cues.
So
Um,
if you're saying if they do want to have sex or if they don't want to?
the former.
If they do want to. Yeah, that as well. I think that people are giving each other subtle cues, and women and girls are generally socialized to give pretty subtle social cues, I think. I think we as women, and I know this so well from my own experience, we're socialized to do everything kind of, use sort of subtle cues and soft power and from the sidelines and not to be like, yes, this is what I want and yes, this is what I don't want. That is not a female form of socialization generally.
Yeah, even if what they want is like beneficial for the other person, even in those cases,
Right.
they're not conditioned to be able to say that explicitly.
Right. And because girls have all of this like sexist baggage of like, don't be too forward, don't be a slut, don't be a prude. It's very hard. And I think so, in the same way that boys and men are operating within these really complicated, contradictory pressures, so are girls and women. So it's really hard. And I think girls and women sometimes don't even know what they want because they've been so socialized to please everybody else and put everybody else's needs first. So that's a whole conversation about female pleasure and engagement that is really important. And I think it's it's just very tricky territory. And I think we would do well to really acknowledge it as such. And for sex education, for teenagers to like involve talking about all these complex relational dynamics and all these gendered social pressures from both
Yeah.
sides without judgment.
Yeah, from both sides without judgment, being willing to give the other person a lot of grace for
Absolutely.
handling a situation that's different from how you would have expected them to handle it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know, and also leaving room for the very real fact that there are some like genuine sexual predators and there are some like ways that terrible things happen and we need to acknowledge that and listen to people in those situations too. You know, I don't want to make it seem like every sexual assault is basically just a misunderstanding and everyone meant well, because that's clearly not the case. But you know, I think we have the capacity as humans to acknowledge complexity.
Yeah. But maybe one unfortunate, like, so the whole thing about how girls are socialized to not say what they want explicitly and more like sort of beat around the bush.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe maybe one unfortunate side effect is that there's like a little bit of preference falsification right now, where maybe like there are some boys that would do better in terms of like being more confident and heck, even being more assertive, but like they're like in those specific cases they're not told that it would be better for them to act that way.
Right, absolutely. And also I think there's a bias against them being acting that way in many ways as well. So they've sort of been socialized to be like clear about what they want and everything. But then in that situation, like that can be read as putting pressure on somebody, you know,
Yeah,
you
or like
can't.
maybe there are two like completely different circumstances where one circumstance is seen as putting pressure on the other person and the other circumstance is what the other person actually wants but isn't willing to say so.
Absolutely. And I think that is so true with two different people, with the same person on different days. You know, it's just like, and sex is complicated for everyone. You know, we all want different things. Sometimes our desires don't align very well with our politics. Sometimes, you know, we don't know what we want. We think we want something and then we find out we don't want it. You know, all of these things.
Yeah. One thing you found interesting, sometimes our desires don't align neatly with our politics. I think that's one of the most fascinating things. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the example that springs to mind is like, you know, a girl might say, you know, be a feminist and believe that, you know, they want a very nuanced, sensitive man, but actually what they find more desirable is a very masculine, traditionally masculine, aggressive, dominant man, or the
Yeah.
other way around, that boys feel like they should be this aggressive, masculine, confident person, and actually, or they there was a big thing about unwanted sex that, you know, this is something that it's assumed that boys just want to have sex all the time and in any circumstance. But actually, often they don't want to, and they feel shy and nervous, and they don't want to have sex with that person, and they feel a lot of pressure not to. You know, there's it's gay kids who feel that they should be straight. It's like I mean, it's everybody with every type of political or like ideological views, whether they're conscious or unconscious. You know, it may or may not. You know, it's the deeply religious Christian who is gay. It's the, you know, it's all of these things. I think this is a very well known phenomenon.
Yeah. So maybe would your advice be to like for them to like be willing to acknowledge those desires and maybe sometimes like understand that it's a product of evolutionary biology and that sometimes it's okay for them to have desires that don't map neatly onto their politics. Um,
Yeah, so long as they're not using those desires to exploit somebody else or to do something that's not consensual. I mean, I think that acknowledgement of our own desires is really an important part of being human. And but then the next step is like that typically involves another person. And so, you know, I might feel differently about it if we're talking about, you know, whether um, you know, somebody should allow their natural desire to exploit another human being or like assault somebody or to engage in sexual activity with a minor or anything like that. I don't think, oh, yes, just give free rein to your desires and allow that to, you know, I think we need to think about this on a case by case basis. But yes, I think acknowledging your own desires as a human is healthy.
yeah, that's like yeah, this is an issue where it's so complicated and like trying to like deal with it in like one very narrow way always ends up like harming people. in some.
Absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think one thing that is really important is just sort of open conversation. So I think sexual shame is a really insidious thing. Um, and I think there is a lot of sexual shaming coming from lots of different directions in modern American society.
Yeah. Do you think okay, this is a little this is something that I've gestured to a little bit before, but maybe it's worth spending more time on. Do you think people like you and me, people who do extensive research, maybe like from the perspective of an outsider, we're like overthinking these issues way too much, and
Mhm,
maybe like the process of like doing like 100 hours of research has caused us to
mhm.
develop like these like incredibly strange Overton windows that like make no sense to most people.
To
Like
anybody else.
yeah, maybe
Yeah.
there's some people that are listening to us and being like, why are you drawing these really granular distinctions about like what counts as
Yeah.
reasonable and or not, especially if it's just going to change in the next 5 years.
So I think there's truth in that. And often, I'll talk to, I'll write something or talk about something and I'll show it to my husband. He'll be like, what are you even talking about? You're off in some like sort of rarefied, debating tiny differences in nuance in some semantic point. But I do think that more it's like, it's not that I believe that every person should engage in this granularity, but for instance, like say the justice system, we're talking about laws, we rely on somebody else doing that incredibly detailed thinking to come up with laws that will cover all eventualities and will think about things that you've never thought of. And like, well, somebody else does the complex thinking so that we can get to more simple cultural understanding, if you sort of mean. So it sort of trickles down. So it's not like I don't feel like people are going to engage in it at this level that we're talking about, or that the level that I've had to think about it to write the book, or, but they will experience culture change. Culture change happens by people thinking really hard about things.
Yeah,
And
like
then the effects are more simple.
maybe 5 years ago, maybe some of the stuff that you've written, or like stuff that Richard Reeves has written, or stuff that many other writers have written about boys and men, maybe a lot of this stuff 5 years ago would have been unthinkable, and people would have just been like,
Absolutely.
"Yeah, this makes no sense. You're giving too much ground over to the right, and you're giving too much ground over to toxic
100%.
masculinity."
100%. And I would say that this is shifting year by year by year because, even a few years ago when I started like writing this book, I feel like the cultural climate was really different than it is now. And it will be really different again in a few years. And that is because, well, there's a lot of reasons for it, but one of the reasons is that people are doing all this really complex thinking about these things.
Yeah, so it's only been a few months since your book has been published, but through all the processes of like doing interviews, maybe reading reviews and talking to
Mhm.
your friends who might say like what the hell are you on right now? But like through the process of doing all of that, is there anything that you've changed your mind about or maybe like expanded your line of thinking about a little bit?
Mhm. In the process of since the book has been published, or
Yeah,
so.
like that few month glory period, I would guess. Yeah.
Hmm. I don't think so. In some ways, I would say that. So I changed my mind many, many times during the course of writing the book. So as I was researching this topic, I was back and forth, and like really digging into the kind of complexity. And you go too far one way, and then you kind of overcorrect the other way. And like that was a process. And I tried to write through that process because I think it is really complex thinking. But since the book has come out, I've actually been really surprised by how well it's been received generally. And one thing that's been really surprising is by how well it's been received by men. A lot of boys and men have read this book, which I was not expecting, and has been really heartening. I think most people have been really positive, and things that I thought they might be like, oh, for God's sake, actually people have responded to really well. Like one of the things that I thought would be like, for instance, this is a really tiny example, but like in the book, I write about the way that we call boys buddy and we call little girls sweetheart, and like the different messages we're sending them with those things. And it's such a minor point, it's like so well intentioned. And I thought that when I wrote that, people would be like, oh, for God's sake, why are you
Like
pointing
what
out all
the hell
these
are you
small,
on right
what
now?
are you
Yeah.
on? And like, but actually, I've been really surprised. People are like, oh, yeah, that is really different. And I think it does make a difference. And these things do add up. So actually, if anything, it's sort of given me confidence in my own convictions, I think.
Yeah. All right, so I guess I want to spend the last bit of this interview talking a little bit about pop culture because you
Hmm.
had this like really fascinating section about what you think about the hero's journey and what you think
Hmm.
about like movies and TV shows and how
Hmm.
they're like they how they change like the perception within boys and girls from a very young age. I thought that
Hmm.
was kind of fascinating. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, look, and things are changing a little bit, but I think overall, if you just leave it, you don't intervene at all, you have a girl and you have a boy, then your girl will read and watch and play and see hundreds and hundreds of stories about relationships and about human beings in community with each other. So there are, countless stories with girl characters where it's really about friendship and the whole narrative is about friendship dynamics and, thinking about other people's emotions. And, that is the substance of the narrative. It's not like a tiny little subplot. It's not, the bit that they do before they go and fight the battle. It's the whole thing. And so girls get this message that that kind of relational work is for them, that is how they engage in friendships. That's what's important, that they should be thinking about other people's feelings, that they should be thinking about their own feelings. Boys get a lot of stories just naturally about where human interaction is like competitive. So it's a hero and a villain. Somebody gets drenched in glory and somebody gets killed. There's a good guy, a bad guy, and there's a huge adventure, and and a hero is like saving the day. So it's like one person who's saving the day, and it's competitive and it's aggressive. And so these are two like subtly but really quite substantively different kind of moral universes, like narrative universes, and like how you see yourself within them. So I think a boy is like subtly socialized to believe that he is like the hero on his journey, that he's going to save the day, that there's this expectation that he's going to be slightly superhuman. And then for girls, there's this expectation that they're like this relational being who's in community with other people, that they're thinking about other people's feelings, they're part of a group, and all the rest of it. And these end up, really sort of worming their way into kids' psyches about who they are in the world and how they should show up in ways that are helpful and harmful for both, I think.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about how these things are changing. So how do you see them changing in at least like within recent years?
So I think the change has been very asymmetrical. So I think there's been much more change on the girls' side. So we see a lot of like heroic princesses and female superheroes and um, representation of girls in sort of traditionally masculine roles, like, mighty girls and Supreme Court Justice girls and CEO girls and scientist
Or
girls
like
and
female presidents? Yeah.
female presidents and like so many representations of like how we can get girls to have more power and agency in the world. And we see far less progress on the boys' side. So far fewer relational, emotional friendship narratives about boys. They creep in, they kind of creep in around the edges. So you might sort of see them on the sidelines or you might see them as the subplot. But I still haven't seen anything which is just sort of a um, really emotional friendship narrative about a group of boys that is only about the friendships and
And
the like narrative.
it's not like a secondary thing. It's not like the Lord of the Rings where like
Right,
that's yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So you see those kinds of things where they sort of show up as the subplot, but like where that is the actual story, I haven't seen it. And so I mean, one example that I thought of recently, I don't know if you saw the movie Inside Out.
The Pixar movie about emotions, right?
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
exactly. So that franchise, I watched it with my boys, and like there's Inside Out 1 and 2. And it's this like really complex story about a girl's interiority. She has, you go inside her head, it's all her emotions, and it, which is great. And it sort of helps kids understand emotions. And you see her mom inside her mom's complex emotions, and you see them go back and forth, between tracking each other's emotions. And every time a boy character or a male character appears in that movie, they're like an emotional idiot. So it's like when you go inside the dad's head, it's like, just watching the game, like the emotions are all like switched off and
And
like
maybe
up
that's
on the
another
console.
example of how society unfairly stigmatizes men.
Right, exactly. So it's just like, here's the man who's this emotional idiot, And so it's unfairly stigmatizing him. And it's giving a message to boys, which is just like, oh, this complex relational work is not for you. Learn about your emotions, but
we're just gonna like offhandedly blame you for it no matter what you do.
Yeah. And it's like, we're going to blame you for it. So it's like, we don't teach boys those skills and then we blame them for not having them, and then we mock them, so it's just this like compounding effect when it would have been this great opportunity to like go inside a boy's head and what's happening and the many complex things. And, I have sons. I know that boys have interiority. I know that they have complex emotions. Of course they do. They're human. But yet that is not represented. And had it been a Pixar movie about being a scientist or being a superhero, and they had like done the equivalent the other way around with a girl, like mocking her for not being able to do that stuff, we would have flagged it immediately and seen it as a real like sexist message.
Yeah. All right. Final question. So obviously you did tons and tons of research. You talked to so many different groups. You talked to like social workers, you talk to incels, you talk to like sociologists, et cetera, et cetera. Are there any specific groups where like if you had more time, more research that you would have like spent more time talking to, whether it be like talking more to like film screenwriters or more to like religious conservatives? Are there any groups that like you wish that you could have talked more to if you had the time?
I mean, not specifically because I could have reached out to other people if I'd wanted to. I think it would be interesting to talk to screenwriters and people involved in like cultural production to see why this is happening and whether, what's driving it. Are they purely going on what the market demands, or is there like a way in which the market is driving what people feel and believe? I think that would have been interesting to do. But yeah, I mean, obviously, like my favorite part of the book was the research for the book was talking to the boys, and I would have happily gone on doing that for indefinitely, just talking to teenage and sort of young adult boys and men. Who are they? What do they feel? What do they think about this conversation? I probably talked to 50 or something, but I would have happily gone on doing that for, ever and ever.
Yeah, and you would just be satisfied, just like even as like an entire generation goes by, you would just keep talking to more boys and
and things are changing all the time. And even since like we started having those conversations 2-3 years ago, things are different. And so I would love to do that. I love talking to teenagers. I love talking to young people, and I think especially boys in this moment feel very unheard, and so they love the idea that somebody's listening. And, so those conversations were very, very rewarding.
Ruth Whippman, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.